Gaming Show. Hello everybody, my name is Fortefyre and welcome to the first ever episode of the Ready to Go Gaming Show. I'm your host Fortefyre, and today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. So, traditionally I stick to playing old games or I play arcade games, but I sat down and I remembered how much fun I had on screwattack.com. Now it wasn't anything big or anything, but there was a community that would allow you to do blogs, and for me, I blogged on top 10s, on genres, on mascots, etc. So I sat down the other day and I thought, hey, why not do this in a contemporary setting? I have a camera, I have a YouTube channel, I have a Twitch. Why not give it a shot? So that's what this is. This is going to be a video series that's dedicated to talking about the ins and outs of companies, genres, top 10s, reaction videos, whatever. That's what this show is going to be about. And what better company to use as a guinea pig than Capcom? I know you probably think I like Capcom. I do enjoy Capcom, but I'm not a huge fan of them. After all, I've played Fireside Chats, I've played Arcade Anomalies, I've played tons of them. But let's be honest, Capcom is a perfect guinea pig for this style of video. So why not? But before we get into it, let's go and talk a little bit about the history of Capcom. So in 1979, Capcom started as this company, not to be confused with this company, but the president of this company was the guy who invented this company. Following? So in 1981, notice that this is like a 2-year difference. IRM absorbed the subsidiary by the name of Japan Capsule Computers. What are capsule computers? Well, capsule computers were just like arcade cabinets-ish. They're arcade games. In 1981, later that year, IRM would change its name to Sanbiko. In 1983, Japan Capsule Computers would lose the word Japan and would instead focus on 2 words, Capsule Computers, and combine them to create Capcom. Also during this year in 1983, they released 2 coin-op games that weren't really arcade games, they were just coin-operated games by the name of Little League and Fever Chance. In 1984, they released their first arcade hits, Vulgus and 1942. In 1985, Capcom USA was created in an attempt to market Japan's, games in America. Because of this, the arcade release of Commando, as well as Ghosts and Goblins, was a huge success. Later that year, 1942 would be released on the NES. 90s Capcom was majorly focused on establishing good stocks in the company and trying to get their name spread out. Notable achievements in the 90s would include the creation, obviously, of Street Fighter II in 1991 and Final Fight the year prior. So pretty much after the 90s, after they'd expanded and whatnot, they focused on introducing new IPs such as Okami, Monster Hunter in 2004, Devil May Cry, Dead Rising, etc. They would absorb other companies and they would reach to expand their companies to go places like Hong Kong, Korea, Taiwan, Europe, and Vancouver. Now recently I heard in contemporary news that they might be liquidating the Vancouver office, which is totally fine. They've got so many, there's really no point. So the history is pretty simple, but I'm gonna go ahead and hand it off to another awesome person in the retro community by the name of Shotobro, who was kind enough to collaborate on this video with me and lend me his voice. For those of you who don't know who Shotobro is, his Twitch link will be down in the description below. If you get a chance, totally check him out. I know I'm subscribed to him. So without any further ado, let's get into the meat and bones of the Ready to Go Gaming Show. Sit back, relax, enjoy, and learn a lot about Capcom.
For every category we are about to list, there are some super tropes that are associated with the style of gameplay. In the case of beat-em-ups, you can count on scrolling screens and large amount of enemies, with your protagonist going on a non-stop fisticuffs and odd weaponry wielding adventure. But when you think of Capcom and fist fighting, you probably think of Street Fighter II. After all, Capcom pretty much invented the tournament fighter with its 1991 groundbreaking game. But it's important to know that Street Fighter is not a beat-em-up. It's a fighting game, or a tournament fighter, depending how you spin it. But one of the great things about Capcom as a company is that they love to cross over all of their franchises quite often, and this is how we are exposed to characters such as Guy and Cody, Poison, Hugo, as well as Relento and Saddam, from a completely separate series known only as Final Fight. Final Fight during development was known as Street Fighter 89, a game meant to be the sequel to Street Fighter 1, or Fighting Street on the TurboGrafx 16 CD. It's a bad game. Okay, it's really bad. But what it would become would be Final Fight, the first Capcom beat-em-up and perhaps one of the most well-known and expanded upon beat-em-up games in the Capcom library before the emergence of contemporary games such as Devil May Cry, Dead Rising, Onimusha, and Beautiful Joe. The engine for Final Fight itself would serve as the inspiration for Street Fighter II, perhaps the most well-known fighting game of its time. It does, however, need to be said that there is a significant library of Capcom beat-em-up games, from popular ones such as The Punisher and Alien vs. Predator, as well as a few Dungeons & Dragons themed games, and off-the-wall ones such as Captain Commando and Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, which for the most part, many of these games were limited in scope to the arcade. Whereas Final Fight was the go-to retro beat-em-up, not only in the arcade spectrum, but also in the home console spectrum, selling 3.2 million units over the lifespan of the series. The term shoot-em-ups, commonly known as shmups, describes a game that involves, well, shooting things. It's pretty plain and simple, but it should be noticed that there is a strong difference between shoot-em-ups and run-and-gun games. So, Commando is out of the picture. But what isn't out of the picture is the fact that Capcom sent so much love to the genre despite what direction objects are flying. In fact, the first arcade game that Capcom ever released was a vertical shooter by the name of Vulgus, released in 1984, which kind of was a copy of Xevious. I guess it was more of a supply and demand kind of thing. Sunsum will be the first horizontal shooter in the series, but even then, it had platforming elements as well, so it can't be considered solely a shoot-em-up. However, that same year, a game by the name of 1942 was created, which featured World War II airplanes fighting over the skies of the Pacific Ocean with a P-38 Lightning piloted by the Super Ace on its way to Tokyo to destroy the entire fleet. The game was known for being difficult, but also as a breakaway hit for Capcom. It's hard to pick exactly what game was the best for really either of these two styles of shoot-em-ups. While the 19XX series was the premier vertical shoot-em-up IP, the horizontal shoot-em-up genre had plenty to offer. Starting with the 1985 release of Section Z, in 1986, Hyperdyne's Sidearms was released, maintaining the same sort of science fiction direction that Capcom was seemingly attracted to. However, the horizontal shoot-em-up that is traditionally voted to be the best by Capcom is none other than UN Squadron, which was based on a manga, and had an equally fun spiritual successor, Carrier Airwing, in 1990. Now bear in mind, there are a ton of vertical and horizontal shooters to explore, so why not play them all and see for yourself which game brings you the greatest joy and entertainment? Let us know down below. Platformers. If you don't know what a platformer is by now, then I hate to break it to you, but you've been missing out. Platformers, a subsidiary of action games, makes you take the role of a character that needs to navigate, well, platforms or other obstacles in order to get from point A to point B with a bunch of difficult jumps, unfair enemies, and memorable boss fights along the way. Right from the get-go, Capcom introduced one of the most famous platformers known to mankind, Rockman, also known as the Blue Bomber, aka Mega Man. Mega Man was first released on the Famicom and NES in 1987, introducing the young Mega Man and the first 6 Robot Masters. It had a unique mechanic that involved the freedom of choice in how you played the game and which boss you wanted to tackle first. Additionally, if you defeated enemies, you would receive their special weapon, which was unique in its own way due to the fact that certain Robot Masters were weak to other Robot Masters' weapons. Mega Man was praised by critics and fans alike, but it was not a commercial success. That being said, the team at Capcom knew they had something special. Once Mega Man 2 came out, they had that commercial success, and Capcom was able to accomplish this success with every single release of the game, usually averaging one game every 1 to 2 years. This was applicable not only to the mainstream series, but also to the wide variety of spin-offs. Yup, we're looking at you, Mega Man Sucker, you glorious SNES gem you. Other noteworthy titles that are phenomenal are Strider, DuckTales, and Bionic Commando. Give them a try.
Contemporary Capcom has been really quiet for the most part. It seems at some point within the last 10 years they decided to stop trying blatantly new things and focus instead on their individual franchises, growing them and offering a new generation of gamers opportunities to play games that their parents would have played growing up. But they did contribute heavily to the gaming industry in the 90s, practically perfecting another genre by the name of survival horror with the 1996 release of Resident Evil, known as Biohazard in Japan. Up until its release, the survival horror genre was traditionally limited to simple horror themes, for example 1981's Nostromo and 1982's Haunted House. These games relied on visual elements as well as staples of horror culture as a whole. But with Resident Evil, the ability to use camera angles to generate instability in the player, coupled with a low amount of ammo, and unnerving soundtrack and enemy encounters defined the genre and allowed other franchises to flourish, such as Konami's Silent Hill series. In fact, the theme allowed for the creation of a game that was meant to be a part of the Resident Evil series, but instead it was made into its own hack-and-slash adventure, known as Devil May Cry. I personally remember playing a Ghosts and Goblins spin-off called Maxima, which had its own sequel as well, The Army of Zen. Other landmark titles included the action-adventure Okami, with its brilliantly designed storyline and visual elements, as well as Asura's Wrath. Lost Planet was another critically acclaimed series as well. Recently, Monster Hunter, which was released in 2004, has just received a new release and is taking the public by storm. Capcom even jumped into the RPG world with Breath of Fire in 1993. The game piggybacked on the success of preceding JRPGs, but had a very Western spin, and probably one of my favorite soundtracks. Another game that deserves a lot of credit is the 2012 game Dragon's Dogma. And by the way, please release Dragon's Dogma online in the United States. My coworker demands it, like seriously, I think he has a prayer shrine dedicated to it. With every great company comes great franchises. Today we're going to be looking at a list of franchises that were developed and published by Capcom, starting with 1942. 1942 is a series dedicated to insane bullet hell action and was genuinely created to eat your quarters like popcorn at the picture show. It all started with 1984's arcade release, which was followed by 1943, which had its own Japanese exclusive by the name of 1943 Kai. We did get it in America, but it was known as Battle of Midway Mark II. Other games in the series include 1941, 19XX, 1944, as well as 1942 Joint Strike. It sold over 1.4 million copies and has seemed to have been phased out lately. Ace Attorney. Ace Attorney is a series of adventure/visual novel games where you play a lawyer, and it's pretty awesome. You should totally give it a shot. The first game came out in 2001 called Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney and released 5 sequels. They made 4 different spin-offs, one of which included Professor Layton. The IP was also featured in other games such as SNK vs. Capcom, as well as Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3. I can't stand playing as him, but overall 6.7 million copies were sold. Adventure Quiz. Adventure Quiz Capcom World 2. This one is odd, but it's included as a franchise, albeit not as popular as some of the other games, but it's a quiz game that had 2 sequels. It's simple. It didn't sell nearly as much, but it was a nifty incorporation of all the IPs. Bionic Commando. Bionic Commando is a prominent platformer that I feel needs some love, but it is the first NES game I ever beat on the NES. It was released on tons of game systems, but more so as remakes and HD revisions. The series started with 1987's titular Bionic Commando on the arcades and saw a rename of the same game in 1988 for the NES. Fun fact, it was meant to be a sequel to Commando. In 1992, another game titled Bionic Commando was released for the Game Boy, and 2 more games were released in 1999 called Elite Forces and Rearmed after a brief hiatus in 2008. They brought the series back with the 4th game called Bionic Commando in 2009, which was looked at, unfortunately, in a negative perspective. Rearmed 2 was the last game in the series and it was released in 2011. Collectively, it was not an impressive series though, as the only game to bust a million was the 2009 remake, which I said wasn't too great. Breath of Fire. Breath of Fire is the go-to RPG for Capcom if you want a great gaming experience with deep storylines and a slightly Western approach. The first game was released in 1993 on the Super Nintendo and saw an immediate sequel a year later with Breath of Fire 2. 3 years later, Breath of Fire 3 would be released for the PlayStation with another 3-year wait yielding 4. Dragon Quarter would be released soon after, and finally 6 was released in Japan 2 years ago in 2016 as an online game. Unfortunately, online is dead for the game. What's next for this critically acclaimed series? 3.2 million units were sold. Commando. Commando was a run-and-gun game known in Japan as Shinjo no Okami, or the Wolf of the Battlefield. I knew it was a wolf of something. Okami means wolf. That's something you know now. Anyway, the game saw 2 sequels but amassed 1.2 million in sales. Cyberbots. You're going to see a few fighting franchises on here because Capcom had the formula to make a successful fighting game. One of these included a mecha-style fighting game called Cyberbots Full Metal Madness, released in 1995 for the arcade. It was ported to the Saturn, which is how I know of it, and it's super fun. But you have to have a Japanese console to play them. Darn you, Japan, and your exclusives. Darkstalkers. Speaking of fighting games, let's talk Darkstalkers because you will see a hella lot of their characters in 90s Street Fighter games, more specifically Morgan and Cienko. The series is based on monster lore such as vampires, mummies, and other nifty things and had 3 games, but they aren't too fantastic. For me personally, Darkstalkers is more relevant for being included in game series like Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo and Pocket Fighters as well as Alpha, but that's just me. It never even passed 1 million collectively. Dead Rising. Dead Rising is a weird one. It's a survival horror, but also an open-world beat-em-up with often funny themes. And I've yet to play one, and this makes me sad because it's a highly successful IP. You play as Frank West and basically fight an onslaught of zombies. The first game was released in 2006, and it went quiet for a while before the 2010s, where they kicked out a few games, with the most recent being 4 in 2016. Frank is also in Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3 as well. 12 million units were sold. Devil May Cry. I really hate this game, and I don't hate many of them, but if I would have been streaming this game, you would have heard more expletives than a pirate ship. Like I said earlier, it was a spin-off concept from Resident Evil and had 7 releases. One release in particular was the HD Collection. I've beaten 3 of them and plan on playing 4 if I can acquire it. The game is set deep in the lore of demons and features Dante and his brother Virgil, but their relationship is kind of iffy. 16 million units were sold collectively. Dino Crisis. Speaking of spoopy games, Capcom did something really weird. They took the spoopy elements of Resident Evil and threw in dinosaurs. To be fair, it wasn't the first time they used dinosaurs for money. Their arcade game Cadillacs and Dinosaurs did that, but it wasn't nearly as scary. I used to be scared of closing the shower curtain after playing this game for 5 minutes. I played it for 5 stinking minutes. The first game was released in 1999 and had 4 sequels, but the most recent one was in 2003. Apparently there's a rumor that number 4 is coming soon. I sure hope so, because I have a vendetta with the game and I want to conquer it. 4.4 million units were sold. Dragon's Dogma. I know I called Dragon's Dogma an RPG, but it's more of an action-adventure game that was released in 2012. We've already talked about it, so there's no sense in going back to it. Please release Dragon's Dogma Online in America. Please. 3.9 million units were sold. El Dorado Gate. A little less is known about this series because it was released periodically from 2000 to 2001 strictly in Japan. It's just your run-of-the-mill RPG. Final Fight. We've already covered this, but if you're curious, 6 titles were released if you don't account for the Blockbuster exclusive Final Fight Guy, which is super hard to find and super rare. Kinda. I know someone who has one personally. The most recent game was released in 2006 called Streetwise, and it wasn't nearly as popular as the older ones. 3.2 million units were sold totally. Ghosts and Goblins. A historical franchise that started with a 1985 Japanese arcade release, Ghosts and Goblins has a memorable theme song and gameplay elements that sticked with everyone that played it. Tons of games have been released for the series to include Ghouls and Ghosts in 1988, which was ported to pretty much everything. Super Ghouls and Ghosts was the release popular on the Super Nintendo in 1991, and an enhanced version of the game called Chomai Kamura R was released in 2002 for the Game Boy Advance. The Wonder Swan saw an exclusive release as well with a 1999 Mai Kamura. And it wasn't until 2006 that another version called Ultimate Ghosts and Goblins was released. Since then, the main series has stagnated, with Ghosts and Goblins, Gold Knights 1 and 2 being phone games. The most interesting fact about this game is that there were 2 spin-off series. The Red Devil from the first game named Firebrand was the star of the Gargoyles Quest series, and Maximo was the second spin-off for the PS2. Overall, 14 titles were released and 4.2 million units were sold. Ghost Trick. This one is an oddball, but received critical acclaim in Japan during its release, selling 24,000 copies the week it was released. It's a puzzle game where you play a ghost trying to save human lives. It's cool, but there was only one. It was made by the same person who made Ace Attorney, Shu Takumi. Lost Planet. Lost Planet is the most well-known FPS from Capcom and probably the only one worth talking about, with the 2006 release of Lost Planet Extreme Condition being highly rated. The game saw 3 sequels and has sold 6.1 million units. Okami. Okami is interesting. I'm actually playing it right now in my off time, and it's considered to be one of the greatest games of all time. Personally, that honor is reserved to Ocarina of Time, but I didn't say the best, I said one of the greatest. In the game, you play as Amaterasu in a wolf form trying to defeat the evil Orochi with the help of a sprite Isun and the amazing power of the Celestial Brush. Now, the franchise only has one game, but with something so successful, all you need to do is slap an HD filter over it and profit, which is what they did in 2012. Will we see a sequel? Probably not. Even though the game was considered fantastic, it didn't sell well for Capcom standards with only 6 million units sold. I don't know business metrics, but I do hope to see a future Okami release. Onimusha. Onimusha is a series I remember seeing like all the time, but I never played it. It's an action-adventure game that focuses on the history and lore of Japan, more specifically the culture of supernatural entities and folklore. The first game was released in 2001 for all platforms pertinent to the age, and was soon followed up by the second installment titled Samurai's Destiny a year later. 3 and 4 were soon to follow, and 2 spin-offs were created as well. Onimusha pulled in 8 million units. Pirate Ship Higemaru. I put this on the list because it's one of the few to have a sequel, but it's a simple puzzle game that was one of the first 3 games Capcom ever created. It's cute. Power Stone. In keeping with the mantra of fighting Capcom, Capcom released a fantastic arcade fighter by the name of Power Stone, but it only saw 1 sequel before being brought into SNK's game series SNK v Capcom. It's truly a fun experience, and it is a departure from the traditional formula, but you should check it out. It's a must-have Dreamcast title, and it is not too hard to find. Rival Schools. Fighter, Fighter, Fighter. Rival Schools is another one of those off-the-wall fighting games. This time it has the concept of school gangs duking it out. Check it out if you get a chance. Sengoku Basara. Sengoku Basara was a series I honestly had no clue about, but I figured it would be important to mention based on the fact that it physically spawned an anime about it. 4 games were released, and it's historically tied to the stories of feudal Japan and features a crowd fighting element. 4 million units were sold. Sansan. Sansan has to be mentioned because it's one of those first games that Capcom created. Check it out if you get the chance. Also, it's based on the Chinese novel Journey to the West, which has a long string of films associated with it. Star Gladiator. With every great game, there is bound to be a different company's take on it. 3D fighting was already popular in arcades courtesy of Soul Calibur, and Star Gladiator took the formula and ran with it. Many gaming enthusiasts believe that it's a fresh take and is a great competitor to Namco's fighting series. A sequel by the name of Plasma Sword was released in 1998 in the arcades as well. Steel Battalion. This game has a crazy cult following due to the insanity of the controller that was needed to play it. Traditionally, I leave out Capcom games that weren't made by Capcom exclusively, but this game is really fun. Unfortunately, the sequels couldn't compete with the hype of the first game, and the Kinect system used for Steel Battalion Heavy Armor was much to be desired, sealing the fate for the game series. Techromancer. Another great fighting game, much like Cyberbots, Techromancer, known as Chokosenki Kikayo, was released in 2000 featuring 9 different playable mechs. It was a standalone, but the Dreamcast copy had a really fun online functionality as well as minigames for the VMU. Capcom Versus series. The Versus series is an amalgamation of the entire Capcom universe. The first release was X-Men vs. Street Fighter, which was released in 1996 following the hype of obtaining X-Men licensing for games. Using Street Fighter style controls, it featured a fair balance of both X-Men and Street Fighter characters. The next game in the series was Marvel's Superheroes vs. Street Fighter, which again was released on the arcade in 1997 and was ported like its predecessor to Sega Saturn and PlayStation. In 1998, the series would take a massive explosion, expanding the universe to include all of Marvel with Marvel vs. Capcom Clash of Superheroes. The concept of tag teaming was looked down upon initially, but people eventually warmed up to the idea. The next installation, Marvel vs. Capcom 2 New Age of Heroes, was one that I spent tons of money on. It's a fantastic game that brought aboard many new characters, upping the roster from 15 to an outstanding 56 fighters. You'd have to unlock them, of course. The first game from the series I physically owned was the 2011 release Marvel vs. Capcom 3 Fate of the Two Worlds, which dropped the roster to 36 characters, still bringing a bunch of phenomenal members of the community together. The final game in the series was just released in 2017 and unfortunately dropped the roster again to 30, but we get to fight as new people now, so I guess that's cool. Oddly enough, with 16 titles released throughout the world, only 8.6 million copies were sold. Strider. Strider is a hack-and-slash game that led the pathway for many other games such as Ninja Gaiden, DMC, and God of War. It predated Street Fighter and was highly recognized as being one of the greatest arcade games of all time. Strider received a NES port in 1989 that was a lot different from the arcade game and maintained clues that the player needed to find in order to progress the storyline. Strider 2 was made by Tiertex. It wasn't made by Capcom at all, which was much to the disappointment of many people. But fear not, Strider 2, notice the number 2, not Roman numeral 2, took the arcades by storm in 1999, completely revamping the game and bringing much needed energy to the series. A Ninja Gaiden-esque sequel was made in 2014 that has a much more explorable environment than its predecessors and is considered a success. Beautiful Joe. Do you like movie-themed games? Then you'll love Beautiful Joe, a side-scrolling beat-em-up that involves a character that is lovable and funny at the same time. The first installment was released in 2003 for the GameCube and 2004 for the PS2. 2 more sequels were created, one being for the GameCube and the other for the DS. So here we are, the leaders of Capcom, the golden franchises that stood out above the rest and claimed the throne of being some of the most successful games in the Capcom library. Number 3. Mega Man. There was a time that Captain Commando was the mascot of Capcom, which worked because his name fit into the title of the company. But there was a subtle character that simply fit the bill. He would be known as the Blue Bomber, the myth, the legend, Mega Man. The Mega Man series was a massive overtaking by Capcom to keep a critical character alive in their library, and for the most part, it worked. In 1987, the first game was released, but we already talked about that previously. With 6 levels, independent bosses with unique weaknesses, an amazing soundtrack, and a cool boss rush, this game set the framework for the entire series. However, the first game really didn't sell well, but that didn't stop Capcom from taking a chance to create what people consider to be the greatest game in the series, Mega Man 2. Mega Man 2 was released in 1988, taking place 1 year after the previous entry. Dr. Wily, the antagonist from 1, created 8 new robot masters to fight Mega Man. 1990 saw the release of Mega Man 3, which included the sidekick Rush the Robotic Dog, and featured Proto Man, and also had 8 levels with robots in charge of mining worlds. The next year, sticking to the formula, Mega Man 4 was released, playing the same as before, with 8 robot masters to go after, as well as a new antagonist, Dr. Cossack. In 1992, Mega Man 5 came out and changed the formula just a tad to include a Buster Arm that could charge to inflict more damage, but lacked the game's innovative plot and seemed kind of bland. It was at this time that people began to catch on that Capcom was sort of recycling concepts. But why not? After all, the Mega Man series was a success. In fact, keeping with the pattern of releasing Mega Man games within every few years, 1993 saw the release of Mega Man 6. This time, it featured a tournament by Mr. X. No relation to the Streets of Rage character, of course. Jumping to the Super Nintendo, Mega Man 7 was released in 1995 and was perhaps the shortest development time for the series, only having 4 robot masters to fight. Mega Man 8 was the first game made for 32-bit consoles in the series and included anime-style FMVs, again only having 4 robot masters to fight. The main series was quiet for a while, but that didn't mean that the series wasn't getting any attention from Capcom. We'll get to that in a second. But the world was shook by the storm that was Mega Man 9, released on the Wii, PS3, and Xbox 360. It returned to the 8-boss concept and was considered a fantastic return to the series' roots. In Mega Man 10, we were given the option to play as Proto Man and even as Bass, if the conditions of the game were filled. I mean, you did pay for it after all, it was DLC. According to Capcom, a new Mega Man 11 is slated for release this year, so definitely check it out. Wow, that was a doozy, but don't worry, it doesn't stop there. While the main series was going on a steady uprise through the years, Capcom played with the idea of having a more serious experience with Mega Man on the Super Nintendo. This series was known as the X series and had 12 releases spanning from the SNES to contemporary consoles. Mega Man Legends was another spin-off that had 3D environments as opposed to the traditional side-scrolling that was popular with the series. Mega Man Legends, The Misadventure of Tron Bonne, and Legend 2 were all PlayStation titles that were unique and fun. A third Legends was planned, but was ultimately cancelled. In 2001, the idea of implementing the Mega Man IP with a sort of tactical RPG-style series was planned and enacted with the release of Mega Man Battle Network, which took place in an alternate universe as the main series. The game was unique and had 7 different sequels and even a board game. On the Game Boy Advance, loyal Capcom patrons were able to play a game called Mega Man Zero that paralleled the X series. Talk about Mega Manception, which had 4 titles of its own. In Mega Man ZX and its sequel ZX Advent, we were able to play as a female protagonist for the first time in the series. And finally, the Mega Man Star Force series, again a tactical setup, 3 games released as part of the Battle Network concept. Some spin-offs were made as well, such as Dr. Wily's Revenge 1 through 5, as well as Mega Man handheld releases. Mega Man and Bass, as well as Rockman and Forte, were 2 other great games. Mega Man entered the fighting foray with the Power Battle and its 2 sequels in 1995 and 1996, and of course there were some really weird ones like Wily and Right No Rock Board, a business simulation game, and Mega Man Soccer. Battle and Chase and Super Adventure Rockman were 2 more entries that do deserve some attention if you have the time and want to play obscure Mega Man games. Finally, Street Fighter X Mega Man was a wonky crossover made by this guy that makes the Mega Man bosses Street Fighter characters. It's cool. All in all, considering the multiple series, the spin-offs, and the obscure games as well as collections, a whopping 136 titles were released, considering regional variations, amassing 32 million units sold. Number 2. Street Fighter. Street Fighter as a series is considered the premier fighting game IP in the Capcom library and is credited with being the game to establish the tournament fighting genre. It all started with the 1987 release of Street Fighter or Fighting Street on the TurboGrafx 16 CD. It involved you fighting as Ryu, going on an adventure to prove his strength. Over the course of the game, you meet and fight individuals such as Gen, Joe, Mike, as well as Birdie, Eagle, Adon, and Sagat, all of which were staples in future Street Fighting games. The game was absolutely dreadful, but somehow was considered a commercial success. In 1991, Capcom shocked the world with the release of Street Fighter II: The World Warrior in the arcade, allowing for the selection of 8 new fighters, 2 of which were in the previous games, not accounting for Sagat, at least not yet. Street Fighter II's Super Nintendo port is often considered to be one of the most successful games on the Super Nintendo. The game saw 7 revisions, with the most recent being Street Fighter Ultra in 2017 for the Switch. In 1995, the Street Fighter legacy continued with the Street Fighter Alpha series, which introduced characters from Final Fight, specifically Guy and Saddam, and had a secret character known only as Dan Hibiki. Alpha 2 was released a year later and brought everyone from the previous game to include Rolento, another character from Final Fight. It would also be the first appearance of Sakura, again from Street Fighter 2, would also arrive to the party bringing Street Fighter Originals Dalzim and Zangief alongside. The last entry in the Alpha series was Alpha 3 in 1998, which was odd because Street Fighter 3 would have been released already, but Alpha 3 brought in all the previous characters back and included Cammy, Cody, as well as Julie and Junie. All of the Alpha series games saw a successful line of ports which changed the character rosters as well. The next mainstream Street Fighter series would be Street Fighter 3, which was released in 1997 as mentioned before Alpha 3. Street Fighter 3 introduced the ability for a player to be able to actively parry an attack by moving the control stick towards their opponent at the right time. 12 characters were present in the game, with only Ken and Ryu returning from the original games. The game saw 2 revisions and went through major changes not only in certain characters' voice actors, but also in the mechanics, animations, and the rosters, bringing more series familiars like Chun-Li. In 2008, Street Fighter 4 was released on contemporary consoles, changing from a 2D perspective to a more improved 3D perspective while still having it aimed in 2D. The environment itself would have been 3D, but the actual fighting mechanics took place in the 2D plane. The newest mechanic was something called focus attacks. I don't ever use them, but I heard they work. The game saw 3 revisions and spawned a lot of controversy for having the DLC on the disc but still making players pay for them. Finally, the most recent entry in the main series was released in 2016 and is currently streamed and played competitively to no end. Street Fighter saw a ton of spin-offs, starting with the Street Fighter the movie The Game. It's so bad. But there was also an interactive movie, which was still kind of super weird, as well as the EX series developed by Eureka. Additionally, there were 2 gym-related arcade games, Super Gym Fighter Mini Mix and Puzzle Fighter, and then there was that weird 2010 game, but it's kind of far left field, kind of like Mega Man Soccer. As always, the Street Fighter series would be the subject of cross-universe awesomeness, with characters being a part of numerous fighting games featuring the likes of Marvel, SNK, Satsunoko, Tekken, and Namco. Over the course of the Street Fighter lifespan, 84 titles were released, accounting for regional variations of all the games, and 40 million units were sold. Number 1. Resident Evil. Development for Resident Evil, known as Biohazard in Japan, began in 1993 as a solid attempt to remake the game released by Takuro Fujiwara's Sweet Home. Resident Evil was finally released on the PlayStation in 1994, and the player had the option of playing as Chris Redfield or Jill Valentine, both of which are STARS members that are charged with making sense of the situation involving many murders in Raccoon City. However, things go badly, and the team is forced inside a mansion crawling with zombies and other nefarious entities. The game had horrible camera angles, limited ammo, and an awesome soundtrack with 4 possible endings. 5 versions of the game were made, with the most impressive upgrade being the Director's Cut DualShock version. This game additionally received a remake in 2002 for the GameCube and was included in the Origins collection on the PS4. Resident Evil 2 was released in 1998, featuring 2 different characters, Leon Kennedy and Claire Redfield, the younger sister of Chris Redfield. The game was very similar, but included the ability for other players to tackle the other protagonists' puzzles, which were unique to their particular scenarios. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis was released a year later and had a significantly more action-paced design, additionally including quick choices in the game. The protagonist is solely Jill Valentine and features the titular Nemesis, who slowly creeps throughout the game. Traditionally, Resident Evil games were released on the PS1. Code Veronica was released in 2000 for the Dreamcast. It played very similar to Dino Crisis and featured the two Redfield siblings, Chris and Claire. The story, mechanics, and artistic design were considered different from the series, but it was a success on the Dreamcast, selling 1.14 million. But those numbers did not impress Capcom, who did not consider it a success. We already mentioned the GameCube received Resident Evil 0 as well as the original Resident Evil remake, but we're going to focus on Resident Evil 0, which was a prequel to that game, 2002 Resident Evil remake. This time we were playing as either Rebecca Chambers and Billy Cohen, but we can change the characters at any time. They have this like tag team thing going on. It was well received and praised by many outlets, but the remakes were actually looked down upon. 2 years later, we would be exposed to Resident Evil 4. I personally played it on the Wii in 2007, and you take the role of Leon S. Kennedy and travel to a remote Spanish village to save the president's daughter. Because that's totally practical, right? Basically, a cult of people known as Los Illuminados has kidnapped her, for reasons beyond everyone. It had other characters to it as well, to include Ada Wong. I can't vouch for the GameCube version, but I know the Wii version had some other minigames as well. Resident Evil 5 was notorious for having a backlash of claimed racism as the game took place in Africa. The two protagonists were Chris Redfield and a new character by the name of Shiva Alamar. The game has a deep storyline, so I'm not really going to get into it. Number 6 was released in 2012 and offers players the ability to choose different storyline segments that can be played in any order. The 4 characters are series regulars Leon S. Kennedy and Chris Redfield, as well as the return of Ada Wong and a new character by the name of Jake Muller. It had different modes as well, which were kind of similar to its predecessors, and while it took time to gain sales traction, it peaked as Capcom's second highest grossing title with 7 million copies sold. The most recent Biohazard game was released last year to critical acclaim. It departed from the regular characters and featured Ethan Winters and shifted to the first-person perspective, something radically different for the series as a whole. The series has 5 other spin-off series, the first being Revelations, an episodic adventure that spawned one other sequel. The second is the Survivor series, which was a series of light gun games akin to House of the Dead. It spawned 3 games as well. The third spin-off series was Resident Evil Outbreak, which was an episodic adventure much like Revelations. The fourth spin-off series was Chronicles, which again was a railgunner that spawned 2 sequels. The final spin-off series was the Mercenary series, which had 2 games, but they were ultimately iPhone games. But this was just a slight number of Resident Evil games that were released on the phone. 3 more spin-offs by the name of Resident Evil Gaiden, Operation Raccoon City, and Umbrella Corps also take the cake. Additionally, the series spawned a massive contingency of Resident Evil movies. I've never even seen one. So what kind of sales figures can we expect from a company that perfected the survival horror genre? The answer is 123 titles, accounting for regional variances, and over 82 million units sold collectively.
Alright, that's it for today's episode. I really hope that you enjoyed learning a little bit about Capcom over the course of the video. Again, I'd like to give a shout out to Shoto Bro for lending me his voice and providing some of his expertise. If you like what you saw, go down to his link in the description, click on follow, and check him out. He usually streams on Tuesdays and Thursdays, playing retro games or going after retro achievements. I think right now he's still playing Aria of Sorrow. Also, if you like what you saw here, don't be afraid to click that follow button and give us a like. Down in the comment section below, tell us what you think the next episode should be on. As always, good energy, good vibes. Fortefyre out.